Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. You, as I look, we won't say who are the sheep and who are the goats, right? We won't do that. But I knew that there was going to be several holes this morning. Folks had told me that they were going to be out of town on vacation. I'll be glad when vacation's over now that I've had mine, right? But Suzanne and I, we missed last week. We were on vacation. We had a good time celebrating our 40th anniversary and spending time together. And it was an enjoyable time of being together. And don't ask Suzanne. She may not feel that way. But anyway, but I had a big time. I think she did too. And so we're thankful for the time off that we had. But it's good to be back home. Story is told of William Booth, who was founder of Salvation Army. Now, I'm not advocating for them. There's things that they believe as a faith that I do not hold to. But nevertheless, he was unable to appear at a convention that he was supposed to speak in for the simple reason that he had grown sick overnight. And so those that were at the convention asked if he would send a word to the convention in order that they might have something to think on for a while. And so he sent one word, and it was the word others. And we think about that. That is the world in which we live. We live among people. You and I live among folks. And one of the things that I've noticed in my 62 years of life is that people in and of themselves haven't changed, but their attitudes have. We do not live in a day and age of customer service anymore. I wished we did. Suzanne and I went to a fast food restaurant here 2-3 weeks ago, just right down the road. We placed our order at the kiosk when we went in, thus not having to see anybody and them not having to see us. That was their plan. And so we placed our order with the full intention of sitting down in this fast food restaurant. And so we grabbed our little tent, as they call it, and we placed it on our table. We sat there, and because we had had a busy week, this was before we went on vacation, we'd had a busy week. And so consequently, we were sitting there just talking. Time got by. Suzanne said, "Do you think you ought to say something?" I said, "No." And so we had ended our conversation, and we grabbed our phones, as most normal people do today, unfortunately, and we buried ourselves in our own phones for a few minutes. And then I looked at my watch. I'd been there 30 minutes without food. And so I carried my ticket up to the individual, and I said, I would appreciate if this order was filled. He grabbed my ticket. He turned around. This was not just an employee. This was the manager of the evening, because I watched him boss people around. So I stood there, and I waited, and I waited. I was ready to leave, except, guess what? They already had the caveat. They had my money. And so, as I started to walk off, go back to the table, be with Suzanne, the manager says, "Hey, here," and pushes the sack in my face. I was so pleased, I won't be back. Customer service. Not a, "I'm sorry," not a here's a hot apple pie. Now you catch where I was. Not a, "Here's a hot apple pie," or here's ice cream from our broken ice cream machine. Now you know where I was. Or here's a gift card or a coupon for, $2 off next time. Nothing. Now, I can add to you 2 more stories that have happened just within the past week. I'll not do that. I turn on the nightly news, and just like you, I hear the same stories. I hear shootings, and I hear of gang rapes, and I hear of folks that are not being treated the way they should be treated, with niceness and kindness and generosity. And so this morning, I think in many ways, as the old saying goes, I'm preaching to the choir. I understand that. But I want us to be reminded, this is nothing new, what I'm about to say this morning. And admittedly, when you walk out, you're going to say it was a hodgepodge of things. And you're right. It's a very simple, basic sermon. But it's a sermon on what we really should do to each other. And I'm convinced that if folks would get back to some of these principles that I'm going to spend the remainder of my time this morning talking to you about, that it would be a whole lot better world, and it'd be a whole lot more fun place to live in than what it is. And so you might say, well, preacher, if you are, quote, preaching to the choir, why are you bringing this up to us? Because I believe that it begins with us. It begins with us. It has to start somewhere. And so it might as well start with us and then hopefully radiate through the world. What is it that we should do to people? Well, first of all, by all means, we should love them, right? Isn't that what the Bible says? Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth to obedient faith, to sincere faith, see that you love one another with a pure heart or sincere heart fervently. That's what Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. The Bible, time and time again, talks about love. Love one another. Jesus says that this is important. When he was asked what's the first and great commandment, he says, love God. And then he says the second's like unto it. Just love your neighbor as yourself. John reminds us in 1 John chapter 3 that we're to do all things with love. And that according to the 4th chapter of the book of 1 John, beginning in verse 7, the thought begins in verse 7, going down to verse 9 and 10. He reminds us of, he says, if we say that we love God, whom we've not seen, and yet we hate our brother whom we've seen, he says you can't do that. You can't do that. He says we're to be individuals that love one another. But what's love? And by the way, how much do I love that fellow that but pushed that sack in my face? How much do I appreciate the individual that wanted to make sure I wasn't stealing something as I was checking it out? And I had to watch the video of me checking it out as they butted in. Or how much did I appreciate the manager the other evening picking up my wife's menu right in front of us to move us to a different table without explaining what was going on, as we'd already been sitting there for about 10 minutes. And I thought, we need to get back to loving one another. We need to get back to a time in which we really do appreciate and value one another, because if I love you, here's the answer to love. We can talk about, the Bible talks about brotherly love. It talks about love from the standpoint of storge or just a sort of a friendship type of love. Or we can talk about that deep, deep abiding love. No, I'm just saying love one another. Because Jesus says, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples. John 13. If you have love one for another. That love is defined this way: wanting what is best for the person that you're looking at and loving. In other words, I want what is best for you. You want what is best for me. Loving one another. That's what love is. Love then becomes the badge, Jesus says, which we wear. We may, if we're in official capacity, we may wear a badge from the standpoint of being a policeman or even a fireman. We may wear a badge now at work that basically tells where we work. The badge that Christians wear is the badge of love. I want what is best for you, and so therefore, that badge sometimes is going to block. It's going to block out the ugliness of people's lives. It's going to block out the ugliness of what they do to us. This past Sunday night, Jim gave a really wonderful lesson on when people mistreat us. And the reality of it is, as he said, it happens. Well, when you think about the idea of loving others, sometimes you have to block out what they've done. You have to say, okay, I don't like it, don't appreciate it, but we're going to move on. Because that badge that I wear says what? That I block it out. That ultimately that love becomes not just a badge wherein I block out what has been done to me. But that badge that blocks out also buffers the way I feel about you at times. While Paul would remind us to love the brotherhood in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, we're reminded to do all things in love. You see, buffering a pill. You remember when Tums was that chalky stuff? And I eat a lot of Tums, by the way. Yeah, I have a bad stomach. And Tums was just awful. Well, now it's still not great, but guess what? It's buffered. It's coated. We coat our pills now so that we can take them easier. Well, that's what love does. Sometimes it buffers, it coats what's going on so that we can be individuals that truly love one another. And then love ultimately binds us, according to Colossians chapter 2, verse 2. Paul says that your hearts may be knit together in love. See, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he says what? He says, I want you to be bound by love. Oh, yeah. The song that was so popular in the 70s, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing. God says, I need you to love. Jesus loved people. Jesus is a great example of one that loved even when folks didn't treat him well. Jesus showed love. He preached love. Whether he was hanging on the cross and asked, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There were times, though, that he understood that folks won't always get along. And he told in Matthew chapter 10, when he told those that he was sending out on the limited commission, he says, when you get to basically a city and he says, they won't listen to you, he says, go to the gate, shake the dust off your feet and move on. But it still doesn't mean that you treat people ugly. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, right? That's how he wound out, Paul did, that great discussion of love in 1 Corinthians 13. Stories told of two families actually. It happened in East Kentucky. In a little gorge there in East Kentucky, two families got to despising one another. They got to feuding, if you will. It became serious. It wasn't just a matter of, well, I don't like you. It was a matter of just pure down dirt hate. They hated each other so bad that they'd each built a fence on their side of the gorge to make sure that you didn't cross over. As time would have it, on one side, a young man, and on the other side, a young woman fell in love. They decided to get married, but they knew that the families would not accept this. But they went to their fathers, they went to their families anyway, and they said, hey, we love one another, we're going to get married. We understand the two families don't get along, but we love one another. And they just kept loving one another. And as they kept loving one another, they got married. They kept loving one another, and the family kept seeing this, till finally, one day, the families, both sides, went to their fences, tore them down, and built a bridge with that wood over the gorge and began to love each other. We need to learn to love just as Jesus loved, just as he told us to love. The world will be a whole lot better place, but we also need to give people forgiveness. It's not easy, is it? Because, like I say, what Jim said Sunday night is true. It's not a matter really of if, but when folks will do something to us. And the reality of it is they will. And it'll hurt. I mean, it will literally hurt. And the reaction then can be varied. It can go from the standpoint of making us sick as we deprive ourselves of food and even the sunlight of day because we are so hurt. But then our usual reaction is a knee-jerk reaction. And that reaction is simply this: what can I do to get even with you? What can I do to hurt you? What can I do to show you up to make sure that you hurt like I hurt? The Bible says, though, forgive. Ephesians 4, verse 32, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. Forbearing one another and forgiving one another. Colossians 3, verse 13, you get the drift. Forgive one another. That's what the Bible teaches us. In forgiveness, we have to understand several things. In forgiveness, we have to understand that that individual that has hurt me, that has inflicted pain upon my very being, that individual did what they did. We have to understand that. And forgiveness does not mean that, well, I'm saying that didn't happen. No. Forgiveness is me letting them off the hook for what they did do to me. Forgiveness is me being the bigger person. Forgiveness is me being the individual that's willing to say, okay, you did this to me, but I'm not going to retaliate. For as much as lies within you, live peaceably with all men, Romans chapter 12. And in doing such, we learn to forgive. I'm reminded in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and 22, as Peter talks about Jesus. It says, who when he was reviled not again. I got to thinking about that this week, and I thought I need to do a little research, a little looking into the idea of reviled. Reviled is not the pleasantries, if you will, of, oh boy, this, you're a great fellow. You did everything wonderful. Reviled is the idea of criticism, but it's not the idea of, well, you might have missed this a little bit. It's harsh criticism. It's harsh words. It's harsh action. And Peter says, who when he, talking about Jesus, was reviled not again. Matter of fact, while hanging on the cross, as we said just a second ago, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Strong words, isn't it? And yet it's needed words because, like I say, our knee-jerk reaction is, I'm going to get even with you. And yet, while we look at that, we need to understand that we sometimes need to take time, to take a breath, to stop and think, to stop and consider them and why they would even say such, or why they would even do such, or why they would even behave that way. But then more importantly, to consider, what has the Lord done for me? Have I acted that way towards him in the things that I've said and done? Haven't I acted that way towards my Father? And yet he's forgiven me. Surely I can forgive these people for what they've done to me. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That puts forgiveness on a whole different level, doesn't it? The idea of forgiving others because we've been forgiven, forgiving others as we've been forgiven, with the hopes and the understanding that God's going to forgive us only as we forgive others. Yeah, they'll make mistakes. Yeah, they'll say things. Yeah, they'll do things. Clara Barton really was the founder of the American Red Cross. During the Civil War, Barton had been treated very ugly. She and her brother had been treated very ugly for a period of time by some soldiers from one side. after time had passed, one day she is in a hospital and she is taking care of patients. And people noticed Clara Barton was taking a lot of good care of all of her patients, but especially this one. And they knew this individual, and they knew what that individual had done to Clara Barton. And so someone, supposedly, I guess, maybe thinking they had get one up on Clara Barton, said, "Hey, do you know who that fella is?" And Clara Barton said, "Well, he's so-and-so." "Well, do you know what he's done?" "He's the one that mistreated you and mistreated your brother back in that other encampment." And she said, "No, I don't remember." "Well, surely you remember." And finally, Clara Barton said, "I remember forgetting what was done." Sometimes maybe we have to remember to forget and remember forgetting. That's really forgiveness, isn't it? Not letting them off the hook from the standpoint of saying they didn't exist, but letting them off the hook from the standpoint of saying, okay, you caused hurt in my life. But I think more of the Lord. I think more of the Lord's church. I think more of myself and my soul than I do of the hurt that you caused me. Because the reality of it is, in 10 years, what's it going to matter? In 100 years, what's it going to matter? In 500 years, what's it going to matter? Maybe we need to learn to forgive. Then thirdly, what can we do to people? We can be kind to them. Be kind to them. What is kindness? We use that word a lot. What exactly is kindness? Kindness is defined as when one uses their time, their talents, and or their resources to do what we would call good or to improve the lives of others. It can be generosity. It can be service. It can be compassion. But it's the idea of doing something for someone. It is the idea of going the second mile, isn't it? It's the idea of the Good Samaritan. It's the idea of being kind to people, even if they haven't been kind to you. It's the idea of smiling at people, even though they're really ready to bite your head off. It's the idea of holding the door for someone, even though they're 10 steps behind you. It's the idea of letting that individual have your parking place. My wife got me Friday night really good. She is one of those that wants to park as close to the door as possible. I am one that doesn't mind parking towards the end and getting exercise walking in. Friday night, we pulled into a large parking lot. And there was one that I had seen that was fairly close to the door, about as close as you could get. And so as I was driving past one parking place, I heard her say, "Why didn't you park right there? Why? And I just keep going. And I pull in to the parking place. I thought, oh, she's going to be so proud because she doesn't have to walk very far. One word, selfish. We laughed about that. I laughed about that. Yeah, probably so. Probably should have let somebody else have it that's, healthier than I am. But nevertheless, we need to learn to be kind. Not selfish, not self-willed. The Bible talks about being kind one to another. We just used it, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Use your resources. Use your time, use your talents in compassion, in service, and in generosity towards others. When you think about how we go about doing that, it requires, first of all, that we be sensitive, right? Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than himself. Paul would write to the church of Philippi in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. He says, sometimes you just need to consider the other fellow. You just need to be sensitive to what's going on in their lives, what's happening with them. You need to be an individual that is sensitive to their needs and sensitive their feelings. But in being sensitive, sometimes we have to be individuals that are supportive. We're not to let mercy and truth forsake us. What are we to do according to Proverbs 3, verse 3? Since we're not to let them forsake us, we're to bind them upon our neck. We're to place them in our heart. Solomon's right, and he is. Then we sometimes need to be supportive. Kindness simply means I'm supportive of my fellow neighbor. I try to help them out as best as possible. And in being supportive, I'm sometimes sympathetic with them. Jesus wept in John 11, verse 35, over the death of a friend. Sometimes our friends need support, don't they? Yeah, Job's friends were miserable comforters. That's what he told them. But yet at the same point in time, too, while they were miserable comforters in what they said. They weren't kind in what they were saying. And their judgment was incorrect. Sympathy just simply means sometimes we just sit with people and we listen and we let them cry and we cry with them. They were sympathetic to what's going on in their plight, and we want to do what we can to help them out. Sometimes, though, that kindness is straightforward, isn't it? In Proverbs 27 and verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Boy, that's a hard axiom to follow, isn't it? It's one to swallow. The idea that sometimes a friend's wounds are really good, but the kisses, the buttering us up and making us look good of an enemy, they're deceitful. And so we need to understand, though, that kindness is just straightforward, but it's also spontaneous. As we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men. Galatians 6, verse 10, especially to those of the household of faith. Paul would remind us. You see, kindness does not have to be planned. As we have opportunity. Oh, yes, you go right ahead. You go in. Oh, yes, let me give you a smile today. Why? Not just because I want to. Because I think you look tired and haggard. Let me be kind to my neighbor. Why? Because maybe this isn't their week or their day. Kindness then is shown in many different ways. One of the great stories that I have in my files is a story of a lady who has worked all day in her flowers in the back end of their property. And the little boy looks at his mama and says, Mama, you've worked all day in your flowers. Yes. And you've worked all day in the flowers in the back, not the ones in the front of the house, but the ones in the back. Yes. Why? Nobody's going to see them. And she said, Oh, son. She said, Miss Cook over on the back. Yeah, her property backs up to ours. Yes, Miss Cook sits in her window every day, and she talks about how beautiful my flowers are as she sees them go over the wall. And so I'm making sure my flowers go over the wall. Our kindness needs to go over the wall. That it's supportive, that it's sympathetic, that it's sensitive. We need to be sure to give folks kindness. But then lastly, and very quickly, the best thing you can do for folks is pray for them. Confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that you might be healed. I believe that in many ways that verse aptly applies to the idea of praying for our brethren, especially when they sin, and ask for forgiveness. But I believe James 5, verse 16 is also teaching us a great principle which Jesus taught, and that is pray. You know, Jesus prayed for you. Oh, preacher, I wasn't living in Jesus' day. Well, some of you look, no. Reality is, in John 17, go back and read it. He prayed for you and for me. He prayed for his apostles. He prayed for himself. He prayed for men of all time, beginning in verse 20. He prayed for you. What a great privilege and great presence that is. I've told you about that individual that I know, won't call his name. He's still alive. He's a man that he's a little older than he's several years older than I am, but he also has mental issues. He's a loving, lovable individual. And he would come up to me every once in a while when I worked with that congregation. He'd put his arm around me as he'd walk up to me, and he'd have this smile, and his speech was such that it was not real plain. But it was this, Brother Paul, yeah, I've been praying for you this week. Man, what that did for me. I think we should tell people that we're praying for them. And I think we should mean that. So oftentimes we'll say, oh, we'll be praying for you. And we never do it. Sometimes we forget. That's a reality. Sometimes we just don't do it. But I think not only should we tell people, well, we'll pray for you this week. At the end of the week, write them a note. Hey, prayed for you this week. Hey, thought about you, offered prayer up to God for you. If we begin to pray for people, guess what we do? We soon learn to get along with people. Why? Because you're not going to pray for people that you don't like, and you're not going to pray for people that you don't love, and you're not going to pray for people that you're not kind to and you don't care about. You're going to pray for those that you care about. Now think about who you've prayed for this week. Pray for your family, yes. Did you pray for your members of the church? Did you pray for your elders? Did you pray for your deacons? Did you pray? Oh, please do. Did you pray for your preacher? Did you pray for their spouses? Did you pray for that brother or sister that was mentioned in the announcements that's not doing well, not feeling well? Did you pray for them? Did you pray for that individual that mistreated you? Did you pray for that individual that didn't talk to you the way they should have talked to you, that didn't give you the customer service that they should have given you? Did you pray that the company will eventually get it right in their training? Did you pray for people? Paul prayed for people. Jesus prayed for people. I'm to pray for people. The greatest gift we can carry is the gift of prayer to the very throne of God. And invoke, first of all, the power of God. He's able to do exceeding above all that we think or ask. In God I will put my trust, for in Yah, Isaiah says in Isaiah 26 and verse 4, is my strength. Yah is just a shortened form of Yahweh, which just means God. And God is my strength. But I pray to God not only because of his power, but because of his promises. And here's his promise. His promise is found in the book of Psalms 34. It's repeated again in the book of 1 Peter. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. Verse 15, verse 17. The righteous call upon him, and he answers. There you go. There's the reason. Dear friends, I hope you haven't thought that I've tried to get on you today, because I haven't. As I said, as I began to preach to the choir. I know that. But I think these are principles, very basic rudiment principles that remind us of how important it is to get along with our fellow man. Because as we defined sin back a few weeks ago, we talked about sin as being that relationship, that vertical relationship that we have with God, but also that horizontal relationship that we have with man. And when we break either the vertical relationship or the horizontal relationship, God has told us we've sinned. But as Christians, we let our light shine before men, that they'll see our good works and not glorify us, but glorify our Father, which is in heaven. This morning, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, won't you come? All together we stand and sing.